All right, so in the last segment, I laid out the idea of utilitarianism, the basic idea. I gave you a definition and tried to explain the basic elements of the definition. So in this segment, we're going to talk about why utilitarianism is an attractive idea, why it's appealing as an ethical theory. And then after that, maybe in another segment, we'll talk about the problems with utilitarianism. So I have a list accompanying in the document that I put up there. I have a list of features that are attractive, features of utilitarianism that are attractive. I call this in the document "Attractive Features of Utilitarianism," aptly titled. And so let's go through and talk about these features and why utilitarianism has been so attractive to people. So the first one is what I call the intuitive appeal of the general idea. And we talked about that at the beginning of the last segment, right? Utilitarianism, that's when we just talked about the basic idea behind it before I even gave you the definition of the idea that, well, it has, doing the right thing has to do with making people's lives better, making the lives of those around you better. And that there is something compelling to that. And utilitarianism indeed captures that idea, right? Because it appeals to the notion of happiness, which is a good way to characterize making, people's lives going well, people's lives being better, being happier. And it also captures the idea of making those around you better, in that utilitarianism is not just talking about your own happiness. It's talking about the total happiness number, as I specified last time, which, your happiness is included, but it's not just your happiness that counts, it's the total happiness number. So there's a kind of, it's not a selfish kind of theory or self-centered kind of theory. It takes into account others. And so this is a kind of, this has some intuitive force to it, this notion. So that's one good feature of utilitarianism. Another one is that it has a kind of impartiality that people think is compelling in a moral theory. And what I mean by impartiality, some people get confused about this word. When you're impartial in the way that I'm talking about, it means that you're not focused or biased towards one particular person or group of people, right? Everybody counts equally in your eyes, right? That's maybe the best way to think of it, right? It's a kind of egalitarianism about who counts, who's important, whose happiness counts. Utilitarianism requires that, as we talked about last time, it requires that everybody's happiness be taken into account, right? So nobody's happiness, no particular person's happiness is more special in any certain way than anybody else's happiness, including your own. Your happiness counts just as much as the next person's happiness, It doesn't matter whether, you have some, it's not like rich people's happiness count more than poor people's happiness or vice versa. It doesn't, it's not like some ethnicity's happiness counts more than some other ethnicity's happiness. It doesn't matter, what country you're in, all those kind of things, all those kind of categories that we place people into. None of them matter on utilitarianism, in the sense that when it comes down to happiness, everybody's happiness counts exactly the same. Meaning that a unit of happiness for person A over here is just as valuable as a unit of happiness for person B over here. It's all just units of happiness. There's nothing else that you need to take into consideration. Now, why is this important? Well, a lot of people think this is important in morality because it stops you from favoring or biasing yourself towards certain individuals or groups based on familiarity, ethnicity, the amount of money people have, things like that. And a lot of people think that those things are indeed morally irrelevant and we shouldn't take them into consideration. So meaning that we shouldn't help people more just because they're from our country, or because they're because they're rich and we like rich people, or we don't want to deal with poor people, or you can imagine the kind of distinctions, race distinctions, class distinctions, the kind of things that a lot of people think that those things aren't morally relevant, in the sense that we shouldn't favor people more just because they happen to be from a rich or a noble family or a royal family, or we shouldn't favor people more just because they happen to be the people who are around us. There's lots of people in the world who we don't get to see, but they're suffering too, or they need help, and we should try to help them and increase their happiness. So, for example, there are a lot of people in who are suffering around the world, say in countries that are impoverished or torn by civil war. And one way to think about it is that, we don't need to worry about those people. They're happy. We don't know them. They're halfway around the world. Who cares about that? The utilitarian idea, though, since everybody's happiness is just as valuable, right, is that those people do count, and that we should take their happiness into consideration. And if there's things that we can do that will bring up the total happiness number, which will include them, if we can do things that will sort of bring their happiness number up dramatically, and thus increase the total happiness number in the world, then we should do those things, right? So, since utilitarianism requires this kind of impartiality, a lot of people like that about it. They think that's a good aspect of the theory, right? So, it doesn't allow you to bury your head in the sand, so to speak, and ignore the suffering of other people just because you don't know them, or they're from a different country or a different race, or things like that. So this is a selling point for utilitarianism for a lot of people. They think that, morality is like that. Morality requires this kind of impartiality. You can't just care about the happiness of people that you like, or come from your social group, or are your friends, or things like that. You have to take into account everybody's happiness. So that's a kind of impartiality, right? It means that you're not partial to the happiness of yourself or those that you know or are comfortable with. You have to be impartial in that everybody's happiness counts the same to you. Okay, so that's the notion of impartiality, and a lot of people think that's a good feature of utilitarianism. Okay, another related feature is what I call the wide scope of the moral community, right? And what I mean by that is that, in virtue of us just being concerned with happiness, right, we don't, what's the best way to put this? So you've already seen, as we talked about just a moment ago, that everybody's happiness counts, right? And you can already see, in a sense, why there's a wide scope of the moral community, right? Meaning that it's not as though you just need to fixate on the people that you know, or the people that you're familiar with, or the people from the social class that you're comfortable with. Who you need to take into account on utilitarianism when you act is much wider than that, right? It's any person in the world who's capable of happiness. But there are a couple things worth noting about this that we didn't touch on yet. And one is that it's not just any person exactly who's capable of happiness, but it's anybody who's capable of happiness. So this can include, say, animals, right? And this is an interesting feature of utilitarianism, in that since it says we have to maximize happiness, if, say, animals are capable of happiness, then we need to include them in the calculation, right? So if dogs and dolphins, squirrels, whatever, any animal that's capable of happiness, we can't just do things to them for our own pleasure or happiness if it's going to make them miserable and decrease the total happiness number. So remember in the last lecture when I was talking about the total happiness number, if we took each individual's happiness number and added them all up, well, really, we don't just include people in the total happiness number. We have to include anything that's capable of happiness, animals included, on the assumption that they are capable of happiness. Of course, we could argue about whether animals are really capable of happiness. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about philosophy of mind. You might think they're not, but I think most of us will agree that dogs and cats and dolphins and all kinds of things, that they are capable of happiness. And if that's right, then utilitarianism says we have to take them into account. This is interesting. I guess as a side note, this is interesting just because some moral theories, some very famous ones, don't say that we don't have to take into account animals, right? There's a famous alternative to utilitarianism that says that really tells us that the only people that we have to take into account when we act morally are people who are capable of rationality, of rational thought. So presumably a lot of animals aren't capable of that. My dog may be capable. I don't have a dog, but if I did, I might think that he's quite capable of happiness and unhappiness, but he may not be capable of rationality, of rational thought. So on some moral theories, he just doesn't count, morally speaking. Right? You don't have to. It looks like you can kind of do whatever you want to things like dogs, and that's a lot of us think that there's something wrong with that. So utilitarianism has the benefit, the attractive feature of, that it says that, no, you have to take into account things like dogs and cats and whatever kind of animals are capable of happiness. That seems appealing to a lot of us. It also, utilitarianism also takes into account other creatures that are not capable of rational thought that we think intuitively probably should be taken into consideration morally, like infants, right? So a little infant isn't capable of like rational thought, nothing at least like rational thought like an adult human being. But I think that most of us still think we can't just treat infants in any old way. We have to take account of their well-being or their happiness, and utilitarianism accounts for that. They have to be included on utilitarianism. The same goes for say severely disabled people. If someone is severely mentally retarded, then to the extent that the person is not really capable of rational thought, utilitarianism will say you still have to take them into consideration in your moral deliberations. You can't just treat them any old way you want because they are capable of happiness or unhappiness. The same holds for any kind of aliens or extraterrestrials who aren't human beings, right? Anybody, you get the idea. Any creature that's capable of happiness needs to be taken into consideration, and in that way, the scope of the moral community is very wide on utilitarianism, and a lot of people think that's a selling point of the view. Let's see, what else? So another thing utilitarianism can do is it can account for many of our pre-theoretical moral judgments, right? So when I say pre-theoretical, I mean when we came to the class and just wondered, and with ideas about what's moral and what's immoral, we thought things like punching someone in the face for no reason is morally wrong. Helping someone across the street if they need it is morally right. Lying to someone for no reason is wrong. You get the idea. The basic kind of things. If I had asked you, tell me the kind of things that are right and wrong, you would have given me this kind of list. And notice that utilitarianism actually accounts for most of those things. It actually gets the answer right about those things. It tells you, it lines up with our pre-theoretical or common sense judgments, and that's a good thing for a theory, right? So utilitarianism will say, yeah, you shouldn't come into the classroom and just punch some student in the face randomly. Why? Well, what would utilitarianism say about that? Well, it would say you shouldn't do it because that will actually not maximize happiness. Right? Should you help somebody across the street? Right? Yeah. Say some little old lady is struggling across the street. She's having a bad time with this. And you're walking across the street, minding your own business, really nothing really impressing going on. It would cost you a little bit of time and effort to help her out. And it would make her, it would increase her happiness a lot. Well, what is utilitarianism going to say? It's going to say, do it. Do it, because that's the option that will maximize happiness in that situation. So utilitarianism will line up nicely with a lot of our pre-theoretical, just our common sense moral judgments. So that counts in the favor of utilitarianism. I mean, look, a moral theory that implied that it was morally obligated to punch people in the face randomly, and that when you see an old lady crossing the street, you should kick her and laugh at her and run by, that would not be a good moral theory. That would be evidence that the theory is telling us something false. So the fact that utilitarianism lines up with our common sense judgments, our common sense intuitive judgments about what's wrong and what's right in simple cases, that counts in favor of utilitarianism. Okay. This brings us to a very important point about utilitarianism, and that utilitarianism provides a very satisfying, unifying theoretical explanation for the actions that are right and the actions that are wrong. Right? So it doesn't just leave us with a kind of laundry list in the way that I was talking about previously when I introduced the idea of theories of right action. Right? So it's not just going to leave us saying that helping a little old lady across the street is the right thing to do, and punching somebody in the face for no reason is the wrong thing to do. It's not just going to leave us with that. It's going to explain why each of those things is right or wrong. And what's the explanation going to be? Well, the explanation is going to be, well, the things are right because they maximize happiness, and the things that are wrong because they don't maximize happiness. So it provides a very nice, unifying theoretical explanation for why all the things that are right, and why all the things that are wrong. And this is important. This is important from an intellectual and philosophical standpoint for a theory to do that. So that's one of the main selling points of utilitarianism. What else? Well, I have a couple other things on the list. One of them is that it's a decision-making tool. This is kind of controversial, but look, I mean, when we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, sometimes it's simple. When you see a little old lady crossing the street and she's struggling and you have nowhere better to go, it's simple, right? You help her out. There, easy. But in a lot of situations, figuring out what the right thing to do is not easy, right? It's very complicated. It's very hard. You face these decisions yourself. Right now, you probably have something going on in your life, some kind of relation with family member or friends, some aspect of college or your job where you're a little bit unclear about what the right thing to do is. You've pulled in different directions, right? And this is the nature of life. Right? We're presented with these moral conundrums, and it'd be nice, right, if we had some simple tool to help us make these decisions that would tell us very clearly what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do. Well, perhaps utilitarianism will give us that in some cases. We would maybe a lot of cases. I mean, it gives us a fairly simple formula, and it says just, well, do what maximizes happiness. And you might think, okay, well, that would be a nice decision-making tool. That would allow me to look at certain situations and say, okay, if I do this in this situation, it will maximize happiness, and then that clears up the problem. Now I know what the right thing to do is. There are complications about this, and ultimately, I think it's actually not obvious that utilitarianism will help us. It will make our decisions easier. I'm not sure that that's right. But you might think on the face of it, when you look at it, you might think, yeah, it would provide a simple rubric, a simple test to apply to any option that would allow me to figure out what the moral right thing is to do. So maybe it will provide us, at least in some range of cases, a helpful and a helpful way to make decisions about complicated matters. Okay, so let's see. One further thing that I have on the list, one final feature of utilitarianism that I think is worth noting as an attractive feature is the flexibility of the theory, right? So remember when we were talking about our list of things that are right and wrong? And I noted that for any of the things that we put on the list, we could probably think of exceptions, right? So I could think of situations where it would be morally permissible to steal or even obligated. I could think of situations where it would be okay to kill. I could think of situations where it would be okay to say lie, right? Even though in most cases those things are going to be wrong, right? We were talking about that. Utilitarianism nicely accounts for that, right? Because on utilitarianism, principles like don't lie, don't kill, help others, they're not the ultimate grounds of morality. They are not the fundamental principle. They just happen to be the way that will often realize what is the fundamental rule or principle, which is to maximize happiness, right? So what's at base of all the right things is just that they maximize happiness. But that allows for a kind of flexibility, right? So even though it will often be the case that, say, killing will be the thing that does not maximize happiness, sometimes it will. Sometimes killing will be the thing that maximizes happiness. And then what will utilitarianism say about it then? It will say, do it, right? It will say that if you're in a situation where, what will maximize happiness is to kill or to cheat or to lie, then you should do it in those situations. So it allows for a kind of flexibility in our actions, which we think is a good thing, right? When we think about the particular situation. So take the paper towel case where I said, I kidnap your family, I abduct your family, and I say, go steal me some paper towels, or I'm gonna kill your family members, right? Now, if there was some general ultimate principle, don't steal, then you would be immoral by going to steal the paper towels. And that seems wrong. We think that, no, in that situation, there should be some flexibility. You should be able to steal. Stealing should be an acceptable thing to do. And of course, utilitarianism will tell us that, yes, you should steal in that situation. Why? Well, because that will be the thing that maximizes happiness. And so in that, utilitarianism builds in a kind of moral flexibility. It doesn't make us adhere to some rigid set of rules that we can come up with. It allows them to be flexible in the sense that if breaking them or not following them will be the thing that maximizes happiness, then that's what you should do in those situations. So it has this kind of flexibility that we think is attractive and captures our judgments about how we should act in various situations that we can come up with. Okay, so those are a list of features that I think give a strong basis that make a strong case for utilitarianism, right? It's a very compelling theory in light of all those features, right? It provides this nice unifying theoretical explanation of what right action is that takes into account all kinds of people. It's not selfish, etc., right? So it's an important theory in ethics. It's historically important, and it's still important to this day, for various reasons. So I wanted to, I just wanted to, give you guys a nice example of an interesting moral theory, a theory about right action. And does utilitarianism? I guess that brings us to the question: does utilitarianism then answer our question? Does it give us the proper theory of morality? Well, a lot of people think no. They think it's got interesting features, but it doesn't quite get us there. It doesn't work. So what we'll consider in the next lecture is we'll consider problems for utilitarianism. And I think there are some very serious problems for utilitarianism, and that ultimately leave it such that I don't think it's the right moral theory. I mean, maybe you guys will disagree, but we'll consider that next time.